and I'm just waiting to make sure everything syncs up first, as this is the first time I'm going to be doing a live stream on 3 platforms. Originally, I've been doing just live streams on YouTube, as it's very easy to live stream directly to YouTube. So that's kind of become something I've done all my streams on so far. But I've kind of wanted to branch out to have a D-Live and also stream on my Twitch. Because when I'm not streaming, I'm often either on YouTube or on Twitch, watching people talk about certain things like Neurons Pro and politics, or Kit Bogo with scam baiting, or just any one of other people who are branching out on those aspects. So I decided, you know what, I think it's about time that I figure out how to stream on D-Live and how to stream on Twitch. So that brings me to what I'm going to be kind of talking about now, as I'm making sure we're all up to date on everything. Alrighty, yep, looks good there. Alright. Yeah, this is really exciting for me because although I'm young, I'm only 20, I haven't exactly been super tech savvy, and I only recently have started to stream in itself, and kind of branched out on more long form content. Because when I watch YouTube and things, I often tend to like videos that are more longer and more detailed, and kind of talk about more aspects of situations. Such as I've recently started to watch a YouTube channel going over Game of Thrones characters such as Sansa Stark and Tyrion and Tywin and Cersei, and he's kind of breaking down how the characters could have been slightly changed but still fit into the plot lines of what Game of Thrones in season 8 and all other the seasons were kind of trying to do. And it was something that kind of was very interesting, and all of those videos are at least like 40 minutes long. So since I started to like that content, I'm like, well, how about I try to make that as well? But before I kind of get drowned in on that, I thought I would do just kind of a quick introduction to Roundtable Decision, since I'm streaming on Twitch and D-Live for the first time. So Roundtable Decision was originally a project, a high school project for my school, and my school is an IB school, International Baccalaureate. And you have a project that they call CAS, and essentially it was for community service hours. And the goal of the project was to come up with something kind of new, something community related that you gave insight on. So originally I was kind of wanting to do like a debate type of thing, and kind of have not that my school was at the time was super big or anything, so we couldn't do like debate tournaments. But originally I was kind of thinking, well, what happens if I make a debate team? Well, there were just too many logistical things that would make that project a little bit too hard for my liking. So I decided, how about I do a YouTube channel? And I was like, okay, so how is my YouTube channel going to fit into the CAS program and what all it had included? So I thought, well, it could educate people, because that was one of the things you could pick. And obviously it was worded a little different, but this is kind of the gist. Is education was one of the things. So I'm like, well, what do people kind of need to be more educated on? And I was thinking, 1, politics, 2, philosophy, and 3, mental health. Not in any particular order. Mental health was kind of a topic that wasn't really super discussed, and those channels that do discuss mental health, the big ones are super big because of them discussing mental health. And mental health is an issue, although I don't have a whole lot of experience in it, because in general I do think I'm kind of more average when it comes to my mind and things. But I know a lot of people do struggle with their minds and mental health and things related to it. So I wanted to make a channel kind of talking about those from a research point of view. And that was one of my first full kind of length videos I had on my YouTube channel, and it's still to this day one of the most viewed videos on my channel. And I want to bring that mental health series back, but I'm kind of debating exactly how I want to do it. And long story short, before I get on too much of a side tangent, I was thinking I kind of wanted to bring my mental health series through interviewing experts or interviewing people who might have experienced it, as well as using other points of view and more education-based content for mental health. So that was one of the biggest things I wanted to do with my YouTube channel in education. And I also wanted to do politics, as politics has always been something that has interested me in my schooling and how I've lived my life. I've always have been interested in politics. And politics is something that, especially in America, is very one-sided. And what I mean by that is you're either left or you're right. You either think this way or you think that way. There are very few people that are truly moderates when it comes to politics, and people that are right down the middle, no if, and, or buts, and they view everything directly down the middle. We are human, and we do view things in general with the perspective we were raised in, such as our parents and other things like that. So my cast coordinator was worried that through my political content, it would be too one-sided or too non-educated type of content. So I said, well, give me a shot to kind of show you what I was thinking. And the hours I put to make the video and my research, if the video turns out to be too political or too not fitting the criteria of cast, I will remove it from the channel or I won't do any more of it. So I went ahead and made that video where I talked about the United Nations and the role they had. And ultimately, my perspective of the United Nations was more negative than it was positive, but I tried to stay as most down the middle and purely analytical, kind of like an oversight narrator looking down upon the United Nations rather than directing it just from the perspective of myself. So in general, that's kind of how I wanted my political content to be. I don't necessarily want it to be just me spewing out my viewpoints and just only my viewpoints and try to have my viewers and things believe in what I say just based on that. I more wanted my content to be straight down the middle, not in the way that I try to approach everything down the middle, if that makes sense, but I wanted to at least give a chance for everybody to kind of approach the content and give their viewpoints. And one of the videos I did with that was about gun rights, where I kind of looked on Google for all the top results when you searched guns, and I used a sentence that I can't remember now, but I'm sure I could look it up on my video, but essentially it was just about gun rights. And I searched this one sentence and took the top 10 Google searches about gun rights and where people stood on the issue. And I just read the articles and kind of gave my short opinion of each article after the ones were finished. And I mentioned that FBI statistics tend to not agree with this certain statistics, but that statistic doesn't agree with this statistic. Gun issues and gun rights is an evolving issue that America has been faced with, and a lot of people think needs changing, and your opinion of that is your opinion, and I'm not necessarily trying to convince you just on that. And a lot of people were like, well, you didn't really have a stance. That's exactly what I want. I want more educating type of content rather than just purely down the road trying to make you believe what I believe. So that's kind of how I started Roundtable Decision based on that project. But now that I'm done with high school and I'm done with the schooling, or at least high school, and I'm going into college and have been in college, blah, 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 I was like, how do I want to develop my channel? Well, in general, I'm going to keep the same sort of content that I was making, but instead of having to make these kind of really narrowly viewed political videos, I more wanted to talk about and research and think out loud through these live streams, or maybe through solo videos about certain issues and my opinions of it along with other people's opinions of those issues. But I'm kind of mainly trying to distribute through political content that politics, although it is very, very your side or my side, it can have a viewpoint and a perspective that tries to look at both and ends up deciding on something based on that. So that's kind of how I quickly wanted to introduce myself of Roundtable Decision. And those that are on Twitch, it's Roundtable Talk, because Twitch doesn't let you have as long as a username as Roundtable Decision. And just real quick, I'm debating if I want to change the name on Twitch or on our other platforms, but at this moment, I don't really want to. And the reason for that is because how I made up my name. So, because of me wanting to kind of show all perspectives, I was thinking of what type of symbolism kind of I could think of for how all perspectives were shown. And I was thinking the round table. And then I kind of thought, well, what about the round table? And I thought, well, the Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur, those type of events. And I said, okay, so round table. And then ultimately I was debating between Round Table Talk, as my Twitch is, Round Table Podcast, but that already existed, and a few other names. But I ultimately decided on Decision, because although you had these discussions and tried to show all perspectives, you had to make a decision at the end and move forward. So that's kind of how I wanted my YouTube channel to be, or my Twitch channel, or my D-Live, how I wanted my content to be. I wanted it to have a discussion, trying to understand people's sides, but making a decision at the end, even if not everybody necessarily agrees with your decision, but they might be able to see your logical patterns and how you ended up making that decision. So that is the very long intro of what Roundtable Talk or Roundtable Decision is and the things related to it. So at first I was going to I was thinking of what I wanted to cover. And those that are in my title, I'll just quickly adjust that for now. I have It's July 4th Talk, because I'm going to talk about July 4th and the different things relating to it, being more political sides of the channel. And then I'm going to approach the novel perspective. So before I kind of dive in deep into both, I just wanted to quickly to mention that, as I just was saying earlier, my politics side and perspective and news coverage is I want it to be very much trying to understand people, and those that may come in my chat later or may come on my channel, my next live streams or anything else. I do like your feedback and appreciate your comments throughout, because it gives me your perspective, or even if you agree with me, it gives me your reason for why you agree with me. But ultimately, I'm looking for why you don't agree with me, or why you think I'm maybe not approaching the situation right. Because my perspective is trying to fully understand something rather than not being able to understand that perspective. And then later on, I'll talk more about the novel side to my program, because I do think it is very different to what a lot of people are doing. But before I drag on and make this way too long than it needs to be, I'll get into the actual content of today's stream. So I was just generally thinking about July 4th. So we all know the state of the world, or the state of the planet we are living in today. And how do I say this? A lot of times America's freedom has come very proudful, especially in the South where I live. A lot of people are proud of America and understand its independence and the good ways of America, rather than its independence being just based off the bad perspective of what America stands for. So before I get bogged down on all things, I wanted to quickly say my perspective on America's Independence Day. Ultimately, I am very happy to be American, and I believe that America stands for more good than it stands for more bad. And I've had a lot of people in my family and people I know, friends, families, and other things that served in the military. And ultimately, I think that is the greatest sacrifice you can make. And the people that died on the field, even though it's not Memorial Day or Veterans Day, it's still a very honor-based service and situation. So ultimately, I'm very proud to be in America and to be called American and other things related to it. But I do understand that there is a darker side to America's history. And ultimately, that's been brought out through Black Lives Matter movement and other protesting groups that get related to it. And one of the most common things that gets talked about in protest, or in America's as being the darker side of America, is that America used to have slaves. So that brings me to kind of a brief talking point I wanted to discuss and kind of think out loud. So America has had slaves before, and ultimately that is about history. And history is very important because ultimately you have a lot of debates on whether history should be removed or changed or rewritten or minorly adjusted, those types of things. Those are all kind of saying the same thing. But a lot of people think and talk about how America's past was a situation that was through slavery was bad. But again, kind of bringing me back to what I kind of wanted to discuss and think out loud was history itself. So although that part of America's history was bad, doesn't necessarily need to be rewritten and changed through the defamation of statues and other things. And that's kind of a point I wanted to discuss a little later. But before we get to that, I first wanted to think about how this situation and these protests first started. So I did a stream about a week ago where I covered the most recent news when Chaz was still a thing and active protests were happening for tearing down statues that were actually physically happening during the time where I was talking about that live stream about a week ago. And it's important to remember where we stand. And I say where we because I think that the majority of Americans all agree that George Floyd's death, who sparked all these protests, was a murder, and the police officer that did it deserves justice in all perspectives. That was an outright murder, and the fact that we had it on camera and it was so decisively a murder made the protests and the activism from Black Lives Matter that much more impactful. And I also wanted to say as my second point, although Black Lives Matter protesters sometimes get labeled as extremists or other type of labeling groups, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's what they are. A lot of times these protests getting led by the Black Lives Matter movement during the day were peaceful. I remember the situation in Houston where they kneeled down on a street and all prayed during that time when George Floyd died for as long as he was getting knelt on, which I believe was anywhere from 9 to 11 minutes, if I am remembering right. So they all kind of prayed in unison and in unity with each other, and that was a peaceful protest. And there are so many more examples I could give of the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd's and being peaceful, and that's very important. But the fact that these protests during night completely changed. And this is what drives me somewhat crazy with a lot of conservative media. And conservative media tends to group these peaceful protesters and these violent protesters together. Although let's put it this way. I kind of think of it as a Venn diagram. We all know what Venn diagrams look like. You have the circle, you have the other circle, and you have the parts where the circles overlap in the middle. And that's the section that they both share. Therefore, both events happen. And it's the smallest section. I do think that a lot of the peaceful protesters were on that side of the Venn diagram and that perspective being peaceful. And then on the other side, you had the purely violent Black Lives Matter protesters. And I'm saying Black Lives Matter as the movement. And not all people who are protesting labeled themselves or were Black Lives Matter's people, or however you want to phrase that. But you also have the section of the protesters that were shared. So I guess the easier way to explain this Venn diagram would be you had Black Lives Matter. Okay, let's remove Black Lives Matter as a title. You had peaceful protesters on one side, and then you had violent protesters on the other side, and then you had the section where they shared. So that's kind of how I viewed the Venn diagram. So in long story short, from that Venn diagram example, you could think of it as a lot of the protesters were peaceful. Some protesters were peaceful and violent, and some protesters were just purely violent. But looking at the situation from a perspective that is above and not necessarily ingrained in the physical events and what's happening, like a lot of conservative radio stations were talking about, was this. The protests were peaceful during the day and violent at night. They were violent at night, and those weren't from the people that were actually trying to cause change. So an easy way to think of that is the people that were peacefully protesting and trying to cause change from happening were people that were doing it for the good. A lot of the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole were people that were doing it for the good and were peaceful, like Martin Luther King. His big thing was about being peaceful, but still showing your rights and showing that you want to be more, how can I say it? More, have your rights improved through peaceful matters, as I guess the best way to put it in what I'm thinking now. But nobody looks at a protest that is violent and views it as the same. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think that the Black Lives Matter was causing these protests to be violent just by being there, such as the case in Ferguson, or I believe it was Ferguson, when they tore down a statue. This is years ago, and part of the white supremacy groups also were there, and there was a lot of violence between both groups of the people wanting to tear the statue down and the people not wanting to tear it down, and they came head to head, and it turned out pretty badly. And that wasn't necessarily the fault of Black Lives Matter or any other protesting group being there. So I want to clearly isolate those two situations. So looking at the protests during the day, I didn't really see much wrong with them, and that's kind of what this article was talking about, with protests being on July 4th, obviously the Independence Day of America, and today, if you're watching it tomorrow, yesterday. Woo, kind of interesting how that works. Anyway, but a lot of people were trying to group them together, and that's something I think I've repeated this several times now, but it's something I want to make ultimately very clear, was that the protesters in the morning and during the day were generally peaceful, and the protesters at night were not. And those protesters at night, I would largely say, were not led by protesting movements, although you could say they might have stirred some people, as conservative media has tried to talk about, but I just don't necessarily believe that. That brings me to kind of the second point relating to this, or third point, depending on how you want to group them together. But during the night, a lot of these protesters, and I remember talking to a fellow Freedom Scoop writer, and quick shout out to that, freedomscoop.com has a lot of YouTubers and Twitchers and D-Livers that all kind of stream and talk about politics and other things relating to it. And you have the generational gap, Stephen Ingaramus, J.R. Edgar, Edward is kind of his channel. But a lot of these people kind of have been trying to understand the situation, and we're all part of a smaller group. So I would highly suggest you checking out Freedom Scoop if you like this sort of content. But as I was just kind of saying, a lot of people are taking this situation and saying it's only this or only that. And I don't necessarily think that that's the case. And as I was just briefly saying, I was discussing with another Freedom Scooper, Robert, from the Generational Gap, and we were kind of talking about how a lot of these violent protesters were coming from out of state. And Stephen Ingaramus actually physically went to protest and live recorded it through Periscope on Twitter. And he saw some of the violence and kind of rude sayings towards the police and other things that were happening at night. And in the morning, that wasn't necessarily the case. Yes, you had a few people here and there, but it wasn't necessarily the common theme that you could see at night. And these protests on Stephen Ingaramus' channel and Periscope would last for hours. So you could watch the whole thing and kind of see how the progression went. And I think it's very important that we see that progression. But before I quickly move on, I do want to mention that I don't think that the Black Lives Matter movement is perfect. And I do think that they have some flaws. But I think it's important that we view what they're doing now independent from what they did in the past, at least for now. Because a lot of people are grouping what they're doing now and viewing it purely as bad, when I don't necessarily think that that's the case. And I think, especially now, a lot of racism is coming up to the front, because you're actively having people talk about it. A lot of times it was kind of briefly getting talked about through movies or content like that, but I would offer to say that now it's being talked about everywhere. You could hardly go anywhere without hearing somebody mention the movement or mention the situation we are in today. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing, because I do think America needed to address this dark history, and eventually it was going to come out. And I think it did come out through George Floyd's death and all these protests. And I don't think it was all for the good, but I do think it did some good, at least towards the movement and making the people who were feeling suppressed and down a little bit better. And again, I don't necessarily think that it was fully good, but I don't think anything is necessarily fully good. I'll take a quick drink break here. Alright. So I kind of blabbered on about that a lot, but I think it's time to kind of fully dive into this article I pulled up here, what talks about some of the July 4th protests that are happening. And I thought it was important to provide content on George Floyd's protest in general as relating to what's happening now. So July 4th, 6 p.m. Protests have started ramping up ahead of the official start of July 4th celebrations, with kickoff at 6:45 p.m., with a series of military flyovers and President Donald Trump's speech from the White House South Lawn at 7 p.m. While demonstrators wove through the city during the day, large crowds have colonized in areas around the White House, with a few hundred protesters at nearby Black Lives Matter Plaza. Vendors are selling shirts and ice cream. A group of protesters stood an American flag and handed out paper flags for a flag-burning challenge at 7:30 p.m. Another group of merchants is making their way to the National Mall. Earlier in the afternoon, a group of protesters marched north along Georgia Avenue from Draw Park, and I apologize if I'm saying that wrong, chanting "Black Chocolate City" and "Black people used to live here." A few hours later, a large group moved down 13th Street Northwest in the direction of the National Mall, holding a large banner with "What does freedom really look like?" written on it, and briefly blocking the New York Avenue and then Pennsylvania Avenue. Jack Jansen, a 27-year-old barber in D.C., rode ahead of a group on his bike, helping clear the streets as they marched through. Slung across his back was a police shield, now bearing the message "Defund, disarm, and disband." He said he took it from the officers who cleared protesters trying to pull down a statue of Andrew Jackson across from the White House in late June. "It's about time I could flex my privilege for people who so often can speak too little," he said. Excuse me. Derek Walker, a 47-year-old from Stafford, Virginia, also joined the protest on bike alongside his 12-year-old son, DJ. He said that while he celebrated the 4th of July in traditional fashion last year in Boston with his family, this year feels different. The 4th of July used to mean independence and freedom. However, given the circumstances of society at this point, it's just really another day. Walker had said he has been coming into D.C. 3 days a week for protests since late May, and that his recent activism was fueled by fear of what his own kids could experience. He rides his bike around Stafford, he said of DJ. "I don't want to stop him and say no. I don't want him to grow with fear, but he already has it. We were riding through one of the neighborhoods here in D.C., and he said, 'Dad, we could be shot for being here.' My 12-year-old said that, and that broke my heart." And then you have other tweets from this article that talk about people's, tweets or thoughts of protest and certain events relating to it. And I'll read those before I kind of give my thoughts on this article and other things relating to it. July 4th starts with protests scattered through D.C. July 4th in D.C. started with a few desperate demonstrators and marchers through the city, including a sit-in at the Supreme Court and another at a Black Lives Matter plaza that continued from Friday night. Around 11:30 a.m., a group of few dozen Trump supporters marched past the National Museum of African American History and Culture, some flashing a hand sign known to symbolize white power, flanked by a group of Metropolitan Police Department officers on bicycles. Some members of the group carried an insignia associated with the Proud Boys, a Southern Poverty Law Center designed hate group affiliate with white nationals and alt-right extremist views. The group marched past the African American History Museum and east towards the U.S. Capitol, taking photos on the National Mall, but didn't seem to have a certain destination. Few were seen wearing masks. Around 2 p.m., vendors lined the sidewalks of Black Lives Matter Plaza, where about a dozen tents remained from an overnight protest. A man played the drums outside Lafayette Park, where a fence has kept protesters from entering. Posters said police cleared the 8th Street encampment around noon, asking them to relocate north to BLM Plaza in a span of about 30 minutes. An organizer of the overnight demonstration, who only identified himself as Sleaze, said the group, who prepared to remain in D.C., Mayor Muriel Bowser, commit to reforms that would defund the police. You can't say Black Lives Matter and call it a day, he said. You have to put policies in place to make sure that black lives are treated like they matter. Sleaze said he is not celebrating the holiday. It was independence for white landowning man, he said. Women weren't free, black people damn sure weren't free, and Native Americans weren't free. It's nothing to celebrate. And it has a few more accounts, but they all kind of say the same thing. Not that I want to diminish what they said, but if you're interested in reading the full article, I'll have it linked in my YouTube description if you want to check out that and read the article fully for your viewpoint. But I thought it was curiously mentioned about the Proud Boys. Not that I'm necessarily believe... How do I say it? I don't think that the media's coverage of the Proud Boys was necessarily 100% fair. But at the same time, I don't know if the Proud Boys were 100% in the right. Again, it's somewhere in the middle was most likely right. Most likely, what the Proud Boys did was try to influence a situation that ended up happening so that they would become somewhat infamous in there. Because a lot of I would say both sides to it, liberals and conservatives, a lot of people like to be martyrs for the cause and want to be the person that gets remembered for what they did. So right now, censorship is very popular, and you have people like Steven Crowder who almost daily say, oh, we were censored from YouTube, please support us, we were censored, oh, we were censored, with Alex Jones and other things. In a large part, I think that's because that's kind of what conservatives get riled up on. Conservatives don't like when they are censored. So with you trying to get censored, not that I'm saying that Steven Crowder was necessarily doing it, I think he more probably saw an opportunity once it happened to follow up on it and to get a lot more views and a lot more money directly from calling the censorship card that he used. So that brings me to kind of my next major point, and I've talked a little bit about it so far, but the tearing down of statues. And I find it kind of harder for myself to take a middle ground when it comes to statues, because it's almost like trying to rewrite history. And I'm not necessarily a fan of rewriting history, but I can see perspectives of people who do want these statues down because what they represent isn't necessarily 100% good. But I think we could all agree that there are certain statues that are getting targeted that don't really make much sense for getting targeted, such as Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, and founding fathers like that. Although the founding fathers, with Thomas Jefferson and others, did own slaves and participate in that during the time, they were founding fathers, and ultimately made the system that America was built on. And although, yes, slavery was allowed and black rights were largely reduced, you can't necessarily just blame them 100% for that, because that was what the way it was, if that makes sense. And I don't know if I'm necessarily describing the situation as best I could, but I don't really see their statues getting torn down because of that. And a lot of times, conservatives make it as simple as, well, you're rewriting history. Well, by doing that, you're tearing it down. You're trying to shape it to another image. History needs to be remembered for its good and its bad. And ultimately, although I try to take the middle ground as much as possible, I think I necessarily fall on that when it comes to statues, because I myself am trying to be honest here, as I want to be with you who are all watching either now or later. I want to be as honest as I can. I don't necessarily view a statue as being something that makes people suppressed. But you could say that the pure art of having a statue for Confederate generals or soldiers and other things is oppressing the minority type of populations. And I can't necessarily disagree with that, because, one, I haven't experienced that, so I don't really know that from a first-hand perspective, but rather a perspective that comes from different viewpoints. But I do think it's important we take them into account. So in the large part, I would say where I stand is keep the statues, but maybe move them to a museum or something related to it, because I do think it's important that we remember history for, again, its good and its bad. But I don't necessarily support is vandalism of statues and complete tearing down just for the sake of tearing them down. I don't think that that's necessarily what America stands for and what we should view ourselves as, because history is extremely important. And again, I want to make it very clear, is I do understand the perspective of someone who might view the statue, because again, statues are made for honoring somebody, because a statue is very much physical and stands for a lot when someone gets a statue made out of them. It's very much a honor type of situation. And honor is something that is very huge when it comes to situations relating to people. If you have a statue made of yourself, you're somebody that's a decent deal, even if it is just a local statue that your council put up or something related to it. But I have this article that kind of has several pictures of the statues getting removed and what the statues were of. So you have Stonewall Jackson in Richmond getting removed. You have Stonewall Jackson in Richmond, Virginia. You have in Frankfort, Kentucky, President Jefferson Davis getting removed. You have a cage statue of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Frankfort, Kentucky. Then you have a traffic cone and rope being placed on the Confederate General Jeb, or J.E.B. Stubert, the morning after, and again in Richmond, Virginia. Then you have an unidentified man on the Confederate Navy graveyard. Then you have a headless Christopher Columbus that was at a protest on June 10th in Boston. And then you have a Confederate statue hanging from a street post in North Carolina. And you have this statue here, a statue of a Confederate soldier in plank sit on a flatbed bed truck at the old Capitol in Raglan, North Carolina on June 21st, 2020, after protesters pulled down two similar statues on the same monument. North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper ordered the removal of several other monuments to the Confederacy. Splash paint covers the Jefferson Davis Memorial in Richmond, Virginia. A statue of Jefferson Davis lies on the street after protesters pulled it down. People cheer as the Confederate monument from Decatur Square in Decatur, Georgia, again getting torn down. And you have in Houston the statue of Dick Dowling from Herman Park. And I've been to Herman Park before, and the park itself was, I guess you would call it a body of water, or you could think of it as a lake or a pond, if you want to call it, but it was very large, kind of square body of water. And on one side you had a monument, and on the other side you had a monument, and there were, I believe, they were faced at each other. So the statue of this Confederate soldier, Dick Doling, was getting removed from one side, and I don't believe that there's a statue to replace him or anything like it so far. But the fact that I've been there kind of makes it a little more interesting, and that perspective. But this goes on for several more examples all the way to number 27 when we stopped at number 13. So you could go, and again, this article will be linked on my YouTube channel after the end of this to kind of discuss. But I wanted to kind of make my statue point somewhat brief, as it is an event that for the large part has happened a little bit in the past for the July 4th celebrations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that July 4th today might not have more statues getting removed of Confederate soldiers. And I do think that it's a very interesting issue. And I don't think it's as simple as one side is making it and what the other side is making it. I do think that the middle ground is somewhat hard to reach, because a lot of people do see these statues and hold large feelings when the other side of the population, or at least the other side of the perspective, don't have any feelings from these statues and simply just see them as stone or brick or granite or whatever you want to say they are. And those two sides meeting in the middle is just something that hasn't happened, and I don't necessarily see happening in the future. But I do think that these statues shouldn't necessarily be vandalized and completely removed, especially somebody like Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson and those founding fathers and major political leaders in society. I think they should be placed in a museum if they don't necessarily want to be viewed in public. And I do think that a rather good stance would, again, letting city governments and local governments decide what to do with the statues. And if they democratically get voted to be removed, the government can decide where they want to put them. And ultimately, if the government then decides to keep them elsewhere in a box and not ever be shown anywhere else or seen, then that was voted through those local governments. And I'm very much a fan of local governments and local people getting together rather than just random chaos and situations that kind of has been seen so far. I'll take a quick drink break again. Alright, so I quickly wanted to talk about this. Governor Abbott and the state of Texas. So 2 days ago, I got a text on my phone. No, actually yesterday, I got a text on my phone that from Texas, I guess you would call it, or from Apple, that essentially said that you could be fined up to $250 for not wearing your mask. And that was something that was very big and something that I didn't necessarily think Texas would ever go to. So as you can see here, and I'm going to read directly from it. I don't necessarily know if you could see it on my phone, but I had the text there and I posted it on my Twitter, which is Roundtable IB, if you want to see it directly there. But I'll read the text word for word. And it was public safety alert. The state of Texas now mandates all residents wear masks while inside buildings that are open to the public and outdoors. When it is not possible to maintain 6 feet of distance from people outside of your household, punishable by a $250 fine. This Independence Day, we are depending on you to help slow the spread of this deadly virus. So that is what the text read. So ultimately, it was saying that you now have to wear a mask within businesses. And I myself work at a grocery store, and the grocery store I work for mandated that you have to wear a mask for customers inside. Therefore, if you don't have a mask, you can get one provided for you, and ultimately it is up to your decision. But again, it's a very forced your decision. So a lot of people are wearing masks whether they want to or they're not. And those that don't know too much about Texas, Texas is very, very, very much people who are very much, oh, it's my way. Oh, this is America. It's my way. You have to do it this way. You have to do it the Texan way. You know, you have the common phrase or the common slogan or whatever you want to call it from Texas that everything is bigger in Texas. And that is something that is kind of funny because Texas, again, is very prideful. Texas has the most Texas flags out of any other state by far. And I believe Florida was the second the last time I kind of looked into flags per a state. I don't even know how they necessarily measure it, but Texas is very prideful of itself. And Governor Abbott is very much somebody who is conservative by any words of it. So I didn't think that Governor Abbott would issue a mandate to have a face requirement and a business requirement to only have a certain amount of people within your business, such as restaurants being reduced down to 50%. So I'm not going to read this word for word because it's kind of redundant to what I read beforehand. But before Governor Abbott kind of came down with this mandate in Texas for coronavirus and all that, he left it up for each of the counties and said if the counties decide that they want to or they have to wear a mask, then it can be mandated by that county, but it's only by county by county. So you had certain counties, like the most famous being Harris County, deciding that you have to wear a mask and mandating it. And due to the Texas law, what Governor Abbott pushed through is it was now mandated in Harris County, but its neighboring counties didn't necessarily have that mandate. But now, about a week later, I would say, and yesterday, the Greg Abbott came down and said that you have to wear a mask, period, regardless of whatever county you were in, even if you're in the more counties that are very conservative and not like Harris County, that is ultimately a bigger city and more at risk for affections of coronavirus, as you could see in the uptick in the past couple of weeks and days. So I just kind of quickly wanted to mention that. And through myself working in a grocery store, I could tell that a lot of people were a little bit aggravated by the situation of having to wear a mask. Because ultimately, as I was saying earlier, Texas is very much that state that is pro-Texas, pro-America. You know, you don't force me to do anything. Freedom of choice, freedom of speech, freedom of guns, freedom of whatever you want to say. That is very much a Texan thing. And that's why it was rather surprising to see it. And surprising to see the grocery store that I work in beforehand pass that you have to wear a mask through the business and mandate beforehand from that as well. But I thought I would kind of briefly mention Trump and what's going on with July 4th and CNN's perspective. And again, I made a whole video on YouTube, and I'm planning to remake the video with a couple of other different situations. So it's going to be a different video, but kind of have the same point I'm trying to prove, that CNN, Fox News, all those mass media sites are very, 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 very biased. And that's a very bad thing to get into. So if you're reading just one site, CNN, or you're reading one site, Fox News, and that's all you read and that's all you get your content from, you're only getting one side of the political spectrum. And again, most often, whatever's in the middle is the most right. So it's very bad if you only get your news from one side. And if you are someone that is very left, then you probably should read Fox News to get their perspective, even if you disagree with everything Fox News has to say. And it obviously goes the other way. If you're someone that is fully Fox News, then you should read CNN to get their perspective of it. And this article is by Maeve Riston. I apologize for completely butchering that. I'm terrible with names. Anyway. Excuse me. On a very different 4th of July holiday, when many Americans are wrestling with the racist misdeeds of the country's heroes and confronting an unrelenting pandemic with surging cases, Their commander-in-chief is attempting to drag America backward, steering fear of the cultural change while flouting the most basic scientific evidence about disease transmission. In a jaw-dropping speech that amounted to a culture war bonfire, President Trump used the backdrop of Mount Rushmore Friday night to frame protesters as a diverse left-wing mob that intends to end America. These opponents, he argued, are engaged in a merciless campaign to wipe out our history, defame our heroes, and erase our values and indoctrinate our children. On Saturday in the nation's capital, the Trump administration had planned July 4th celebrations that ignore Washington, D.C.'s Mayor Muriel Bowser's concerns about public health guidelines, although at least there would be some social distancing measures at the White House that were ignored in South Dakota, where the president largely acted as if the coronavirus didn't exist. Instead, when Trump spoke on Friday night of a growing danger, he was talking about an entirely different threat than the rising coronavirus cases. He referred to the threat in America's heritage rhetoric intended to rev up his base at the time when many Americans are attempting to relearn the nation's history with greater attention to the wrongs inflicted on Black and Native American people. Repeatedly using pronouns like they and them, Trump sought to play on the fears of the minority that appears to be strengthening according to the polls, who were to rise the Black Lives Matter, and as the threat to the historical demise of the white people. He described the goals of protesters who are attempting the right and the wrongs of history as alien to the culture and our values. One of these political weapons, he said, is cancel culture, which would drive people from their jobs, shame dissenters, and demand total submission from anyone who disagrees. We will expose this dangerous movement to protect our nation's children in their racial assault and prescribe our beloved American way of life, Trump said. He mysteriously describes who would tear down statues of racist leaders from the past as new far-left fascism that demands absolute intelligence. So you could, again, read that article in full as it will be linked to my YouTube channel. But ultimately, she goes on and on to say that Trump was in the wrong for mentioning other things happening in America through directly relating it to coronavirus. So essentially, Trump should be talking about coronavirus more than he should be talking about situations about statues and other things. And obviously, I could be taking what she said through my perspective as my initial thought, but that is ultimately what it seemed like to me. And a lot of this coronavirus talk is something that should be talked about, and the president should be taken serious, because people have died and people are fearing this virus as, again, it's the fear of the unknown and something that is very scary because we don't know much about it and there's not a vaccine. And as of now, it's even affecting younger people. And almost everybody, well, not almost everybody, that's a very large number, but a lot of people have at least heard of somebody or know of somebody who has had the coronavirus, or a friend of a friend, or a friend of a friend's friend who has had coronavirus or may have had coronavirus beforehand. So coronavirus is not necessarily something that should be joked around with. And a lot of times what presidents do, or I say what political people do, what she mentioned was rile up their base. And Trump knows that a lot of people who are pure conservatives are going to vote for Trump because he's not afraid to say what's on his mind through Twitter. And that's something that a lot of people dislike Trump for. And a lot of people dislike Trump's mouth. Even people that ultimately say that they might vote for Trump, although they don't really like him, all disagree that Trump's mouth is the problem. Or, well, I should say all people agree that Trump's mouth is a problem. But there is a very core conservative type of population that is going to vote for Trump because of his mouth and what he says, and that he's not afraid to say it. and through revving up that base is purely 100% guaranteeing that he gets those votes of those people, although you could say that he's going to get those votes regardless of what he tries to stir up on his controversy from those situations. And that's something I would largely agree with from that stance, because I do think that you're already going to have those votes even without having to rile up your base. And ultimately, there's some truth to what she is saying and some truth to what Trump is saying. There was a very big kind of funny thing the media was kind of covering when initial protests were happening against coronavirus, such as in Michigan, where there was protests by cars, where everybody got in their cars and we had signs where they hanged out the window, and that was their protest for the Michigan governor and mayor about coronavirus and the massive shutdowns that they were opposing on their economy. And they were trying to do it safe. And then you had the attending of churches and protests after that when government our police forces tried to shut those down. And media was exploding with articles about how these protests could have an uptick in coronavirus cases. And ultimately, there was an uptick, but it wasn't necessarily something that you could say was largely because of those protests in those areas. But then you had the Black Lives Matter protests, and I hesitate to call it really the Black Lives Matter protests, but more the George Floyd protests, and even using his name kind of seems wrong. But the protest as of late in general, where the media hasn't even touched how there could be an uptick from people who most often are in larger groups and closer together and not necessarily even wearing masks that are protesting. And there's almost no articles from the same websites that were talking about those protests and how an uptick can happen. So I do find that rather suspicious, and I have looked for myself, because again, you should never read one thing and fully agree with that one thing, especially if it's on CNN or Fox or any of those big mainstream news networks, because they're trying to preach something that they think is going to get their viewership up and get more clicks, because they're ultimately appealing to one side. So that brings me to my next point, and I was trying to think, well, what are the polls kind of saying with Trump and Biden? Because we do know that Trump and Biden are the two candidates. Biden, about a month ago, I want to say, got fully confirmed, or whatever word you want to use, for the Democrat nominee, and he is therefore going to be the presidential candidate against Trump for this election cycle. And there was recent news about how, according to Gallup and other polls, that Biden was winning outright against Trump, even on the national poll that Biden was winning against Trump. And those that were remembered last 4 years ago, or 3 and some change years ago, if you want to be exact, Trump wasn't leading, and Hillary Clinton was leading those national polls and other polls as well. So those polls don't necessarily mean a complete victory. But before I get into that, I'm going to take another drink break. Okay. According to the Gallup, Pride in the U.S. is the lowest since it's been in an analytics company first measured in 2001. And that goes on about that. Just 22 of Democrats say that they are extremely proud to be American, a 10-point decrease from 2019, and a half of what it was before Mr. Trump, or President Trump. However, 76% of Republicans and 41% of independents say that they are extremely proud. Men express their pride in a higher percentage than women at 45% compared to 43%. The most patriotic Americans are people 65 years and older at 63%, while only 33% of people ages 18 to 29 are reportedly feeling moderately proud to be American. In terms of 8 aspects of the U.S. government that Gallup polls are on, Americans are the most proud of the U.S. scientific achievements, followed by the military, culture, and arts, economy, economics, and sporting achievements, and diversity in race, ethnicity, and religion. Americans said that they are least proud of the country's political system and health and welfare system. Record low American patriotism in the latest casualty of the sharply polarized political climate in the U.S. today. Gallup said, while nearly party group feels proud of the U.S. political system, politics may be affecting Democrats overall since the pride in their country more than that of, by affecting Democrats overall since of pride in their country more than that of Republicans. So that was how Americans feel about America itself and how prideful they are of America as relating to July 4th and its Independence Day. So I thought I would throw that in real quick before I talk about what I was talking about before in the national polls and polling of Biden versus Trump. So that brings me to 538. And 538 is a live polling update site of many issues and many concerns. Excuse me. And they do active polls of the last election cycle, I remember, where they calculate live when certain results come in and other things. And in general, they were one of the more accurate sites, and I believe one of the earliest to have Trump winning in polls and in analysis before the actual event happened, and that being related to it. So right now, YouGov has Biden at 45% and Trump at 40%. Manoff University, what they rank A+, has Biden 53% and Trump 41%, an increase of 12%. And you have all these polls from July 1st, what all have Biden higher with 46, 43, 49, 48, 49, 47, 55, 58. And then you have obviously Trump at the 38s and 40s and low 40s at that. But again, I just wanted to quickly throw that in. As we know, polling isn't necessarily everything when it comes to politics. Although I know some YouTubers that are looking into these polls that are ultimately, I would say, leaning towards Trump if they had to vote for someone, and they are somewhat worried about Biden leading so highly in these polls. Although, again, polls are not everything. But one thing to keep in consideration was that the national polls were a lot more accurate in the last election cycle and in history than state polls. State polls tend to not mean too much, although they are determined from a more local basis. So that is something that I've found rather interesting when listening to YouTubers and reading articles on the data from both. But national polls tend to be a little bit more realistic to what should be expected, but not necessarily provide a full income or a full distribution of what to expect in the election. So that is all I wanted to cover for news and my July 4th talk portion of the video. But I wanted to quickly mention the next part of the video of my novel, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I more wanted to introduce the concept of my novel, as it is something I'm going to actively be pursuing on my Twitch and D Live, as it's something I do think that is rather interesting. But I'm going to be doing a Twitch and D Live stream only, and where I'm going to read my first 10 and a half so pages that I read on my YouTube channel about a month and a half, maybe 2 months ago, when I first started my novel streams. But ultimately, I wanted to quickly give my outcome and have more of an announcement of my novel perspectives and situations from it. And so my novel is a medieval book, or what I'm writing a low fantasy for, and I'm setting it just after the fall of the Roman Empire. So obviously I'm going to have Romans and a few other empires, but I'm also planning to have others empires included in it. So essentially the idea I'm kind of working along with, and those that have followed my YouTube know this, is that I'm kind of talking about different ideas relating to bringing different empires in. So I'm going to bring the Spartans, the Athens, and the Mesopotamian Empire, those type of empires into the medieval times and kind of update them to what I think they would be if they were to actually have lived in the medieval times, and kind of have a epic battle / political drama such as Game of Thrones, kind of what I'm briefly basing my novel series off of, or what you could call my inspiration for wanting to write my novel from. So that is kind of a real quick intro, and I was debating if I wanted to kind of read what I've read in the past on this stream or not, but I decided that I'm going to save that, and on Tuesday I'm going to be doing or Monday or Tuesday, and I'll make an announcement on my Twitter and Discord and Parler, because I have a Parler now, shout out, woohoo. Anyway, I'm going to be making an announcement either on Monday or Tuesday. I'm going to be doing a Twitch and DLive only live stream where, again, I'm going to be reading my 10.5 pages, and I thought it would be better to keep that to one stream instead of just this stream and the next stream, to make it a little easier for those that are first discovering my channel and other things related to it. So that's kind of all I wanted to talk about a little with my novel brainstorming session, and my next one on YouTube and Twitch and DLive that is going to be combined, where I kind of talk about my novel and my ideas and more ideas, and write a little bit, maybe even do some live writing as I've done a little in the past, is going to be episode novel brainstorming 7.5, because this wasn't really a full brainstorming session for my novel series on YouTube. And ultimately, I'm doing my novel series once a week, along with at least one other live stream that's more political or more kind of trying to understand something, maybe even philosophy related, a week as well. And then on my YouTube, I try to have at least one, but hopefully 2 solo videos as well. So I would highly recommend, if you would like my sort of content, to check out my YouTube. And if you stayed this long, you probably have liked what you heard, or at least I hope you have. Anyway, but I'll give a quick shout out. So my DLive and YouTube are obviously Roundtable Decision, and my Twitch is Roundtable Talk, because again, Twitch wouldn't let me have my full name. But I kind of like Roundtable Talk for the Twitch platform itself, because in the just chatting section, I feel like that's more of a Twitch name than Roundtable Decision for DLive and YouTube, although I'm keeping that name. But I would highly suggest also checking out my Discord channel that I have linked in all of the description wherever you're watching the video, as I'm trying to make that one a little bit more active. And I appreciate if you subscribe to it wherever you're watching, or follow wherever you're watching. And again, I would love if you give me some feedback on the video, either through comment section or reaching out to me on Discord or Twitter, because I highly appreciate your comments and your ideas and other things related to it. And I hope you'll catch me next time for my live stream.